Okay, so this is how we're going to do that oil pressure gauge video. We're going to make this PowerPoint first so you kind of understand what's going on and how this is going to work. I'm recommending an electrical oil pressure gauge. So we're going to start with the gauge right here. That's this piece. We'll talk about the brand and why I'm going with a more premium gauge later. That's the gauge. This is the sender unit. This measures the oil pressure. You're going to need some Teflon tape. I recommend some high temperature tape because this will touch oil. Oil resistant tape is probably ideal. This one is an adapter that screws into the engine block. These are some wire connections that you're going to need and some wire. And this is some strong braided oil line so that you don't have to worry about weak line, especially when the line is still in the hot engine compartment. If you're going to run a mechanical gauge, I do have some guidance to do that. My older video is probably a little bit more detailed. We'll start with an oil pressure gauge. This is going to be more expensive because it's a mechanical unit. We're going to use some line. You could also use nylon, but I think copper is better just because it's stronger. It's going to be easier for you to feed, less likely to crack and break. Same Teflon tape. Same engine oil adapter, and same braided oil line. Although you could technically go without this, but I advise against it because, especially on that hot engine compartment, you're really going to want to have the strongest, most robust line possible. We're going to talk about why we're going with an OEM gauge. It's going to be more expensive, but they're used in the factory cluster of my car, which is an E55. Some of the other cars use Bosch gauges. I have some family members that use them in really intense marine environments and commercial fishing modes, and he highly recommends them, and they're precise. And I bought a Bosch mechanical pressure gauge, and it leaked. The gauge leaked, not the lines, shockingly. And we're going to recommend doing an electrical gauge because it's not much more complicated. It's a lot less likely to leak. You don't have oil in the cabin, and the wiring is, like I said, a lot simpler than I initially anticipated. So right here we have an early M113. This accessory drive is going to look different than most of your cars. This is a fan clutch. This is the oil port. This is important. This is the thing that all of these engines are going to have. You're going to unscrew this, and you're going to run that braided oil line in here, and that's going to go to your oil pressure sender, and that's going to go with the signal wire to your gauge, and you're going to have your ground wire and your plus 12 volts. We're going to run the light too, which is going to be a little bit more complicated so you can see the gauge at night. This will be a lot more apparent when we actually take a look at the car and installation. With a mechanical gauge, you're not going to have this oil pressure sender. It's just going to be an adapter to run to your copper or nylon lines. It's going to go all the way here, and you're going to need a positive and a negative line yet again to run to the light so you can see it at night. I think you may need to remove the entire accessory belt on an M113. On the M113K, there is a second belt that sits in front, and this accessory drive is very different. And on the M113K, it only requires removal of the supercharger belt. And then this is where the adapter is going to screw in. I really recommend getting a strong adapter because I initially bought a cheap one on Amazon, and I started to tighten it to get that copper washer to crush, get that sealing goodness against the engine, and the entire adapter broke. Fortunately, I was able to extract it because all the threads were good, and the only tension was the adapter against the block, so when it broke, it lost all the tension. But that's why I have a more premium adapter in our shopping list.
Over to our left, we have a lot going on, so I drew this diagram. We've got air pressure going into the sender unit, and we have a signal wire for the positive to the multimeter. We have a negative wire connected to the multimeter. Here's what that looks like. Multimeter, negative wire attached to the ground of the sender unit, or this fitting. It should be able to ground all the way from over here, otherwise you have too much Teflon tape and you're not going to get a good connection. So that's why I'm putting it over here. Then we have our positive attached to our signal wire. It goes over here. I just made this. This is 14 gauge wire, and we put a little spade connector on the end of it. And we tied the end to our positive. Now we have a good gauge here. That other gauge is no good. It tells us pressure, and we have our resistance right here. I'm gonna pump this up to 10 PSI. We'll notice that our resistance goes to about 40, maybe a little more because I did more than 10 PSI, 40, 50. That means the sender is working, and it means that we can test it. There are other methods of testing it. I'll detail them later, but I think this is the best way. All right, this is the video on how to put an oil pressure gauge in an E55 or 55 compressor car. So right here we have some wire. Here's where this wire goes. So up the front of this engine, and this is much easier to interpret in the PowerPoint, there is a plug that goes into the engine. Take that plug, it goes to 1/8 MPT, and then you attach this 4AN oil feed. Oil feed goes to this sending unit, which has a signal wire that goes through this with the AC compressor. And we'll tuck this wire away, but I do want some wiggle room in here just because that's ideal. We took a ground because I don't want to screw around with the grounds for the signal wire. And we grounded it right here. I don't know if this was factory on my car or if this was aftermarket. You may or may not have a ground here. Then we took this, we ran it through here. We're poking it through here and through here. This did not require me to poke anything. I did cut this just a touch. And it's not ideal, yeah, whatever. I'm going to spray liquid electrical tape in there to get it good and sealed. The next step is going to be to unscrew this and unscrew this. Pull this. This pops up like a little bit, not crazy amount, and start feeding the wires through. At the same time, we're going to remove the lower dashboard panel here to grab them. So now you're going to undo a T20 there and a T20 there. And with both hands, jiggle it up. Now that we have one hand free, we're going to take our black and green wire and start feeding them directly under and through. It might appear that it wanders to the left or the right, but the wires go directly down in. So, after removing 3 T25 bolts, this will drop. If you look up here, it's best to feel it because it's pretty tight. So you're going to stick your arm up here. You're going to try and go towards the back and towards the fuse box. And it kind of, I'm going from over here. There's like this garbage bag thingy. I think it's just sound insulation, but that's roughly where the wire is going to come in. So let's take.
In the next little clip, it's a really crappy video of what's going on. At this point, I have fed the green and black wires down the fuse box is depicted with that T20 thing. The black wire is wrapped around the green, and I use this tool to grab them and feed them through. This is a generic little grabber tool. They're like $5. I bought mine at Walmart. It's not a great tool, but it gets the job done, and it's better than using your hand. I also recommend using a camera so that you can see what you're doing with the tool. So in the video, I have the camera looking at the wires all coming into the cabin, and I have the little tool grabbing the green wire, and then I pull the green wire out a little bit, stop recording, grab it all the way through, and pull it down. I hope this helps make that next clip a little bit more intelligible.
With the wire down through here, you're going to start feeding it to your final destination. In my case, I'm putting it here. You're going to do that. You're going to remove that Torx bolt and that Torx bolt. Do not remove the radio because that's difficult. Slide it out a couple inches and then feed the wire through like that. You can feed the wire without removing the radio, but you can really get your hand back there a lot better with the radio removed. Then, wiring. These top parts are not super well heat shrinked, I'll address that. But the top two are the light. The bottom three are labeled nicely by VDO, and they are power, signal, and ground. Then install that, snap this back in, and you're going to be on your way. And we're also going to cover removal of the center console. So what you're going to start with is this. First, you're going to pull up on this. You're going to undo these two connectors. You're going to pull this off. You're going to counter twist this piece, and it's going to pop off, allowing you to remove this, and then the radio.
So to finish things up, once you've done that, you're going to wire all the back of the gauge, and you should have a working oil pressure gauge. I will include links below to all of the parts you need to make a gauge like this. There are some parts I expect you to know. I think you should know how to heat shrink all of your connectors and make them work. I think that my PowerPoint demonstration of how to attach the M12 by 1.5 adapter to the front of the engine is going to make a lot more sense than me shakily recording that. For me to actually make a good video about how to attach that plug, you're really going to have to pull the engine out. XF Motorsport has a video where he shows you that plug, but just find the plug, unscrew it, screw the adapter in with the copper washer, put thread tape on the 1/8 MPT to 4AN fitting adapter, screw that all tight, screw the 4AN oil line on, and take the 4AN line to the oil pressure sender, and then begin wiring. To get power to your gauge, I recommend using a ground wire taken from the engine for the signal, just so that they're both in the same place. And that's a really good ground wire I have in my video, although that might not exist on your car, in which case just find a ground. There's tons of grounds in the engine bay and on that fuse box. And then the power. So 12-volt cigarette lighters are typically on a heavy-duty fuse, and my recommendation is just to take a positive wire and splice it off the oil pressure gauge, off the cigarette lighter twice, one for the gauge itself and one for the light. And I also recommend taking one splice off the cigarette lighter for the negative of the light. But I do advise running the negative for the sender unit and gauge itself in the engine bay, just so that you're dealing with less wires and so you can see the ground there. And make sure to check all your connections with the multimeter. And I recommend heat shrinking the back of all of the wires on that oil pressure gauge and sender unit for just to keep them nice for a long time.
So as a final wrap up, this is the installed product. Here's some documentation that I found on some Mercedes forums. This is a little diagram showing how the gauge gets installed. They recommend removing the fan clutch. This is a Mercedes technical service bulletin, if I'm not mistaken. So we asked around on some forums and we got some pressures. These are minimums, which are 10.1 psi at warm idle, and everything's up to temperature, and 43 at 3000 RPM. On the forums, we see 75 to 85 psi from one guy and a cold start, and 15 to 20 at idle. Mine's 70 at a cold start, 12 at idle. Of course, this is pretty dependent on oil. And then here are the devices they use in that forum post.
The cigarette lighter gets key on power. We can see all the connections back there. They're heat shrinked. You get the positive and negative here. Get the signal, ground, and the other one down there. See, this is key on power. Now it's on again. We'll start it. Hear my radar detector chirping. And my car is a little bit warm right now, so the pressure is a little bit lower. It's not super cold outside, it's just above freezing. We're at like 70 psi. I'm gonna make a little bracket to help this not vibrate around, but yeah. Good luck, guys. I think this is a great mod.